This is Ross Feingold on the Taiwan Hashtag program, coming to you from Taipei, Taiwan, and hosted by Storm Media. Today we'll be discussing a winner of the VeepStakes. Yes, the VeepStakes, who will be selected as the vice presidential nominees to run with the candidates who are nominated for the presidency by the major political parties here in Taiwan. The first winner of the VeepStakes is for the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party. As expected, no surprise, Han Kuo-yu, the Kuomintang nominee, mayor of Kaohsiung, has asked Simon Chang in Mandarin to be his running mate. So Simon says, raise your hand. No, not your hand, your hand, Han Kuo-yu. I was making a joke. Play on words. Who is Simon Chang, and why was he selected by Han Kuo-yu to be his running mate? Mr. Chang is no stranger to politics in Taiwan, although not a career politician. Actually, his career has been in the technology industry. He worked for some of Taiwan's major technology companies. He also worked for a major international technology that our viewers may have heard of called Google. Yes, he worked here in Taiwan for Google. And after many years in the technology industry, he served under former President Tsai Ing-wen as the Minister for, no surprise, Science and Technology. He also served as a minister without portfolio. So he does have some government experience. In fact, not only was he Minister of Science and Technology, he was a minister without portfolio, and he was premier. Yes, he served as premier at the end of the Tsai Ing-wen administration. President Ma's second term ended in May 2016, but actually the presidential election was in January. Tsai Ing-wen was elected in January. There was a approximately 4-month transition period. That's the way the law and the Constitution works here in Taiwan. Yes, it's an extremely lengthy transition period. So what happened during that time? The incumbent premier and most of his cabinet ministers resigned. So there was a caretaker government. President Ma appointed Simon Chang to serve as the premier during this stub period between January and May 2016. Here is the funny thing about Simon Chang's tenure as premier. Public opinion surveys actually show that he was popular with the public. It's hard to believe because so many of President Ma's appointees as cabinet ministers, including the premier, especially by the end of President Ma's term after the Sunflower Movement in 2014 occupied the Legislative Yuan and invaded the Executive Yuan, the premier's office, and prompted the rejection of the proposed trade agreement with China, the Trade and Services Agreement, and the disastrous electoral results for the Kuomintang in local elections in 2014 and the national elections, presidential and legislative elections in January 2016, most people looked at Ma's government leadership team and said, President Ma and your team have been awful. That's why we voted for the Democratic Progressive Party. However, Simon Chang actually had fairly high approval ratings during his tenure as premier, however brief it was. Why was he popular? Well, there was a perception that, unlike some of Ma's previous appointees, Simon Chang actually just wanted to get stuff done. He spoke in a direct yet articulate manner. He answered questions directly in the Legislative Yuan, which at that point was already under the control of the DPP majority. They took office in February. The president didn't take office until January. Again, that's just how the laws and the Constitution work here in Taiwan. But generally, he had a popular reputation with the public. So what has he been doing for the past 3 years? Well, he was involved with corporate boards, involved with NGO charity work, no surprise. He wrote a book, again, no surprise, that's what politicians typically do. He has been very vocal about his weekend home in Hualien, where he goes to plant vegetables and things like that. So he's in touch with nature in addition to being in touch with technology. But entering this year, there was a lot of speculation that Mr. Chang was going to run for president, possibly enter the Kuomintang primary, which he didn't do, possibly run as an independent candidate via seeking petition signatures, which he didn't do. And then once Han Kuo-yu won the Kuomintang primary, Mr. Han asked Simon Chang to be head of his policy team. So we've been very critical of some of the output from the policy team. Sometimes that's due to Mayor Han's challenges in articulating what the policies are, but there is a very large policy team headed by Simon Chang, which has produced policies on various issues such as energy supply and education, foreign policy, China policy. So like or dislike those policies, Mr. Chang has been responsible for many of those policies because he heads this large policy team of experts, a lot of people who previously served in government or in the military, for example. So Mr. Chang has been involved with Han Kuo-yu's campaign ever since Han won the Kuomintang nomination. And thus, ever since that point, throughout the last 3 months, Mr. Chang has been rumored to be one of the top candidates to be selected by Han as his running mate. Who else were in the mix for this honor? Well, the former presidential candidate and former New Taipei city mayor, Eric Julie Lun, was the name most frequently mentioned. Another name mentioned was a mayor for county magistrate at the time, but what became New Taipei City, the former Taipei County Magistrate, Zhou Siwei, another longtime Kuomintang political personality. A current legislator for the Kuomintang named Johnny Chang. Chang represents Taichung in the Legislative Yuan. He was also in the mix, along with some other people whose names weren't a surprise as far as being people who served in government under Ma Ying-jeou or in the legislature. So just well-known Kuomintang personalities. Why did the number one most frequently mentioned name, Julie Lun, not get the nod from Han Kuo-yu? Well, probably because Julie Lun lost the presidential election in 2016. He lost in the Kuomintang primary this year. It's not a very good record, even though a lot of people within the party said, we like this guy, and yeah, maybe he's a nice guy. But his recent record of not winning probably wouldn't be very helpful for the ticket. So the Han Kuo-yu team made the decision to go with Simon Chang. You know what? In democracies, usually the running mate doesn't make a difference. So whether or not Han Kuo-yu is going to win this election probably has nothing to do with Simon Chang, Zhang Shanzheng, being his running mate. It all depends on Han Kuo-yu and whether he can convince voters that he's the right person for the job and that Tsai Ing-wen should be replaced. We know from the polls that we discussed here on Taiwan Hashtag that Han Kuo-yu is still far behind, approximately 10 to 15 points, depending on the poll. So we'll see what the polls show in the coming days. There'll probably be a bit of a bump up for Han Kuo-yu, or now the Han Zhang ticket. And we'll review those polls in the coming episodes of our show. But generally speaking, again, it probably isn't going to be what makes or breaks Han Kuo-yu's success as a candidate. It's going to be Han's performance and whether or not he can convince the voters. What about Tsai Ing-wen, President Tsai, who's going to be her running mate? The incumbent vice president, Chen Chien-jen, has said he will not seek another term. So he made it very clear earlier this year, President Tsai, I love being your vice president, but I don't want to do it again. So who is in the mix to be the VP candidate for the Democratic Progressive Party? Well, no surprise, the name most frequently mentioned is former Premier William Lai Ching-te, who challenged Tsai Ing-wen in the DPP primary and lost, and there were some hurt feelings. One, because he challenged the incumbent. Two, because from his side, they felt that the process was kind of designed to make it easier for Tsai Ing-wen to be victorious, and this has to do with how the telephone polls were structured and the public opinion polls. But anyway, Lai Ching-te lost. He laid low for a while. He did some travel, didn't get involved too much in public speaking throughout the summer. But after the summer ended, as we entered September, October, now we're into November, Lai Ching-te resumed his public activities. William Lai Ching-te seems to be campaigning for the vice presidential nomination, and he's made it very clear what some of his key issues are, what he's expecting in return if he is asked to be the vice presidential nominee, at least publicly. He's talked about his support for Taiwan independence. He even said that when he was the premier. He was asked in the Legislative Yuan, and he famously said, I'm a worker for Taiwan independence. So his position is very clear. In fact, that's why he challenged Tsai Ing-wen in the DPP primary, because he said, and his supporters felt that there needs to be a candidate for the DPP who's going to be more actively seeking a separation of Taiwan from China, and there was a perception that Tsai Ing-wen was not active enough on Taiwan identity issues. So she spent a lot of time over the last few months trying to fix that perception. So Lai Ching-te, William Lai's made very clear he still has this same view about Taiwan independence. That's an important issue to him. Another issue important to William Lai Ching-te is the status of former President Chen Shui-bian, famously tried and convicted for large amounts of corruption that occurred during his tenure as president. Both President Chen as well as his wife were convicted of being involved in criminal activity. Yes, they seem to have taken some payoffs from corporate interests. A lot of money was involved. In fact, the numbers were pretty high, tens of millions of dollars. Some of those assets were confiscated by foreign governments. Yes, governments in the United States, Switzerland, and other places were involved in confiscating some of the ill-gotten assets of President Chen and his family. Be that as it may, after his conviction and some jail time, he's been on medical parole, which has been repeatedly extended by the prison authorities, even though they warned him, don't do any political activities while you're on your medical parole. President Chen seems to be doing political activities, a lot of attending events, posting to Facebook, and William Lai Ching-te has been advocating for a pardon, yes, a presidential pardon for Chen Shui-bian. Why is this important to William Lai Ching-te? Well, as we discussed, he seems to be the faction of the DPP which supports more direct moves to assert separate identity of Taiwan, even Taiwan independence. And former President Chen Shui-bian, of course, is associated with this faction of the DPP. He's well known for his views on Taiwan status and also an advocate to separate formally or legally Taiwan from China. So the same support base within the Democratic Progressive Party or within the broader electorate, it's no surprise that William Lai will advocate for that. Can President Tsai and William Lai have a meeting of the minds and make him the VP candidate? Does he even want this job, or should he even take this job? Well, we'll be looking at that in the coming days once President Tsai makes up her mind. But for now, at least we know the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, has picked its VP, Simon Zhang, and Simon says, raise your hand, support Han. We'll see if it has any impact on Han Kuo-yu's polling versus Tsai Ing-wen. I'm Ross Feingold, and you've been watching Taiwan Hashtag.